Thanks so much for coming out. I'd like to introduce the speaker, Dr. Eric Daniels. He's a research assistant professor at Clemson University's Institute for the Study of Capitalism. He previously served as a postdoctoral fellow and visiting assistant professor at Duke University's program on values and ethics in the marketplace, where he was nominated for a teaching award. In addition, Daniels has taught at the University of Wisconsin, where he earned his doctorate in American history. He has lectured internationally on the history of American ethics, American business and entrepreneurship, and the American Enlightenment. He has appeared in C-SPAN's American Writers Series, and his articles have appeared in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the San Diego Business Journal. Daniels' other publications include a chapter in the Evolution of Antitrust and 5 entries in the Oxford Companion to United States History. He also co-authored the U.S. Economic Freedom Index 2008 report. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Daniels.
Thank you. Thank you. So first, I'd just like to thank the Federalist Society here at Stanford for inviting me out, for sponsoring this event, and thank you to all of you for coming out, I guess, essentially during your lunch hour, but I see they provided food, so that's always a good bonus. So today, the topic that I want to address is something of a paradoxical idea, and that is, at this moment in history, at this moment in our political debate, that big government is not the problem. Now, the paradox behind that, of course, is the idea that somehow big government, which is on everyone's lips, and it's literally a problem that has been derided by partisans from the left, from the right, from the middle, and the list of things that people give as items of what the signs that there is a looming big government problem are legion, right? Trillions of dollars of debt, annual budget deficits that the government can't seem to resolve, increasing government regulation over massive sectors of the economy, the healthcare law, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, the SAR box during the Bush administration, the TARP plan, the massive billions of dollars of bailouts, then subsequently in Obama's administration, billions of dollars for recovery, the American Recovery Reform and Recovery Act, restrictions on other kinds of areas in our life, restrictions on free speech, government surveillance, right? We're all learning increasingly about what the FBI can and cannot read in our emails and listen to our telephone conversations. The annual Defense Authorization Act that Congress debates whether or not the government can use surveillance, whether they can kill American citizens, et cetera, the use of drones, the recent lockdown of a whole major American city in Boston in pursuit of 2 criminal suspects. Everything all the way down to what size soda you can drink, right? We can't leave out Mayor Bloomberg. He'd be awfully upset if we did. Oh, he likes to use the drones too, or at least he says he might. There's all of these signs, apparently, that government is growing. That, as traditionally it's called, the size and the scope of government is increasing. And I'm here to say, okay, that's not the problem. Now, I don't want to suggest that each of those things does not have some bad element. That there's not something inherently wrong, or in fact, in some of those cases that I've just mentioned, fundamentally wrong about what's going on there. Instead, what I want to suggest is that intellectually, those of us who want to defend liberty, those of us who care about freedom, ought not to focus on the problem of size. The problem of size, or even size and scope of government, is actually a wrong, an imperfect focus on what is actually at stake. Defenders of liberty need to understand and need to focus on the fact that big government is essentially a meaningless term, as far as I'm concerned. Since you're law students, I think it's comparable to something like judicial activism, right? Judicial activism, famously, I think Randy Barnett at Georgetown Law Center once defined judicial activism as any decision that I don't like, right? Which is how people usually deploy it. And big government typically is used in the same way. Big government is any government program that I don't particularly approve of, or any government program that I don't particularly approve of, the size of it, not necessarily the fundamentals. What I want to suggest is that defenders of liberty, defenders of freedom, need to do away with, need to abandon this shibboleth of big government. And they need to focus instead and recognize instead that size is not an essential aspect of determining the propriety of a government program, of a new law, or of a government agency, or of any kind of government action. Instead, there's another standard that we need to turn to. Now, I want to concretize this for a moment with the idea of, to draw an analogy, the idea of a medical doctor. Imagine for a minute that you're a medical doctor, or you see a medical doctor, and a patient comes into the office who has increased in size. The weight of this patient has gone up dramatically in a short period of time. And the doctor declares, out of hand, we need to either put you on a weight restriction diet or we need to do surgery. Now, the problem here, as many of us might realize, is that the doctor hasn't actually asked the question that the growth arises in some context and for some purpose. Is the growth in the patient, for example, in the result of a pregnancy? Is it a cancerous tumor? Has the patient been sitting around on the couch eating pizza all day and not exercising? Or is the patient engaged in a bodybuilding program, eating a lot of protein and trying to bulk up for a competition? The question of the cause and the nature of the growth in this patient is, of course, what the essential question that the doctor has to ask. It's not simply that the doctor can just declare out of hand that any growth must be reversed, must be stopped and then reversed, and the patient must return to the previous size. Without a knowledge of the actual source and nature of that growth, the doctor would be engaged in a serious case of malpractice. Now, the easy answer that I want to give before I get into some of the deeper issues in this, is that it's not essentially a question of large or small when it comes to evaluating government. The ideas of I'm a small government guy or that's big government, I think need to be abandoned. Instead, what we should focus on is the idea of good or bad government. As has been frequently suggested when I've mentioned the title, the ideas behind this talk, people often say, oh, you know what, you should really title it, Why Size Doesn't Matter, It's How You Use It, right? Which is essentially, it captures a kind of irreverent way of capturing the idea that it isn't essentially about the size. It's about what government does. So the answer, in short, before I get to the more developed part of this, is that it requires a standard of evaluation. We can't simply say good or bad and then simply shift our values from being a program that I don't like because it's too big to being a program I just don't like. Instead, we have to actually articulate and identify a standard by which we can measure a government program and hold it up to that standard and say, does it actually apply to that? Is there a functional aspect of government that actually applies to this standard? The standard, of course, that I want to suggest is that government's central purpose, government's main objective should be upholding and protecting individual rights. And that should be the benchmark against which we actually measure any given government program. The functions of government need to derive from its central purpose. Now, the main meat of what I want to talk about today is why this is such a problem. So you might say, okay, Eric, why do you think that this is such a problem? I'm on board with you. I like individual rights. I believe in freedom. I believe in liberty. But I still want to say, look, that budget deficit is too big, or that new regulation is too complex. Why is that such a problem? Why do you think that it is something that we need to lose focus on, put that aside, and regain a focus on individual rights? And the reason is a dual problem. The dual problem, on the one hand, has to do with a measurement issue. And on the other hand, has to deal with the conceptual issue behind this question. So the measurement issue is frequently deployed. You see white papers by think tanks all the time. You see media pundits talking about this, academics even talking about this. Many of my colleagues, in fact, have published this that I like to argue with about this. The idea that simply measuring government is not only a simple thing, but something that is very revealing of the essential goodness or badness of government is something that we need to do away with. It's a tempting intellectual framework. So, for example, one of the most frequently deployed arguments about the size of government is to measure the size of government relative to the total gross domestic product of a country. Now, for those of you who have any training in economics, you already know what a kind of mathematical problem this is because you're measuring government as a size of government plus other productive activity in the economy. G is part of GDP. But leaving aside the mathematical problems, the question is, what percentage of the economy is government? Right? In other words, if we add up the total value of productivity in the economy, what percentage of that is created by or originated by government? And the statistics vary. Of course, today that's probably consumed, the government consumption of this factor is probably somewhere in the 20% to 28% range. But I want you to do an intellectual exercise for a second. Imagine two countries, country A and country B. And for all intents and purposes, they're doppelgangers. They're identical in every way. They have the same technological development. They have the same population. They're like alternate universes, right? Except one of them has a GDP spending ratio for government of 11%. So 11% of the government, or 11% of the economy is taken up by government. And the other one has 20%. And I ask you the question, giving you no other information, which of these countries is freer? Right? If you consult many of the studies, and I have colleagues that do very sophisticated studies, the freedom of the world, the rankings where they say, oh, these countries are freer than these, and they rank these countries, this is one of those numbers that's often used. They declare per se that countries that have government that spend less of their economy as a function of GDP are freer. But the question that I want to ask is this sufficient information for us to understand whether or not that country is freer? Consider, for example, if country A, the one that only spends 11% of the GDP on government functions, and country B, 20%, if country A, for example, had insufficiently funded court system, right, something that we can all agree upon is an essential function of government, providing a court system to adjudicate disputes between individuals, to resolve our differences not with duels in the street, but rather in the court of law. And in country B, there is a sufficiently funded court system that adjudicates and commits resources to adjudicating these disputes between private individuals. Which country then is freer? Well, in country A, you might say, well, actually, there's insufficient amounts of government. It's not simply, as the old 19th century saw was, the less government we have, the better, because in this case, there may be insufficient amounts of government. The court system can't handle all of the cases that might arise. Or consider, for example, if country A and country B differed, not just in their ratio of how much spending was in a component in GDP, but rather the question of how much of it is dedicated to functions that we would approve as legitimate functions of government, if that's going to be our standard, versus those that are illegitimate. So in country A, which only spends 11% of its economy for government, has 50% of that spending on rights upholding functions of government, and 50% is pure redistribution, taking from one economic class and giving to another. And then country B, which has 20% of GDP, has 90% of that spending toward the function of upholding and protecting individual rights, and only 10% to what we might call pure redistributive functions. In that case, we might say, in fact, the larger government, the bigger government, by this measure, is actually the one that is that's more consonant with the goal of protecting individual rights. So these measurement problems are very, very deeply rooted in the very argument about big government. A number of the ways, for example, that big government is typically measured. Let me just give you a few of these and then characterize why there's certain problems with them. Another way that people like to define big government is say, okay, the spending issue may not fully capture the problem. That's fine. Right? GDP is not a very accurate measure. Most economists don't really like the idea of GDP as an accurate measure of economic productivity. So let's talk about how many laws there are. Undoubtedly, we can go back to Jefferson and the Declaration. We can go back throughout the whole rule of law tradition and say one of the aspects of an overburdening, powerful government that might be what we declare as too big would be a government that has too many laws. Too many laws can create complexity, can stultify the economy, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the measures of big government, and that's been done over time, is to simply measure the number of pages, for example, in the Federal Register, the number of laws. A famous study, Amity Shlaes just recently popularized in her book on the Great Depression, famous study actually calculated, for example, when the National Recovery Administration was implemented in 1933 by Franklin Roosevelt, the NRA had these codes, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with, these codes of industry conduct. And within the first year of the administration of that program, the number of pages in the NRA code literally equaled and in fact exceeded the number of pages in the US code to date. So essentially one government agency in the space of a year wrote more pages of rules and regulations than the entire US government had in its existence to that point. Now that undoubtedly is a crude proxy for the idea of what we might call big government. The problem is that not all damaging laws, not all laws that are clear violations of individual rights that are damaging are necessarily long, complex laws. They're not all, for example, the health care bill. Right? And the health care bill, even though I think it's probably on balance, every page of it might have something bad on it, I'm not sure. I haven't read it, and most of Congress hasn't either, after all, and most administrators who are now trying to deal with it haven't read a lot of it. But there might actually, believe it or not, be good things in it. I doubt it, but there might. Right? It's so complex we don't know. The problem is that laws can be very, very damaging in terms of their respect for freedom and upholding individual rights, even though they're very, very brief. Consider the favorite example I have is the Sherman Antitrust Act. A massive, all-encompassing law that literally would fit on one page of text. The 5 sections of the Sherman Antitrust Act are simple, they're straightforward, well, they're at least straightforward in terms of the number of words on the page. Not so straightforward in implementation. Dozens, if not hundreds of cases were required to actually implement this law. And in most of these cases, it was an instance where government was trying to enforce competition against market dynamics by violating individual rights of certain business owners in preference for a certain vision of competition or in preference to particular businesses in those cases. But the law fits all on one page. And you say, well, is that law, if every law was like the Sherman Antitrust Act, simple but yet deceptively damaging to the economy, damaging to individual rights, and you just counted up the number of laws in a country, you might say that countries with very simple, concise laws are, quote, freer than others because they're smaller. But in fact, that's not necessarily the case. Imagine, for example, a new law characterizing, regulating, and laying out the parameters of intellectual property in an emerging technology sector. Right? Legislatures have to deal with this kind of question. They have to actually lay out the ways in which rights-respecting rules exist in a free society, and sometimes because of the technical nature of the industries that are emerging or because of the types of relationships that are existing, they have complex laws, laws that are longer than just 1 or 2 pages. That law itself, because its rights upholding, is actually a good law, whereas the Sherman Antitrust Act, which seeks to enforce one vision of competition on the economy, might be a bad law, even though on that measure of size, it's much smaller. Now, another plausible measure, we might say, of the size of government or of the badness of big government is the number of people who work for the government, or sometimes it's also said the number of people who are, quote, dependent on government. We all know how well Mitt Romney deployed that meme in his campaign, this idea of the 47%, et cetera. But the problem, again, with this number is that if you look at the trend of the number of government employees, particularly at the federal level, it's been fairly flat since the 1990s. It, of course, goes up dramatically over the 20th century during the periods in which the United States is involved in foreign wars. The military obviously grows dramatically. The infrastructure to serve that military, for example, during World War II grew dramatically. And then it comes back down. But since the 1990s, it's been relatively flat. But the question is, how can it stay flat? Well, in part, it's through manipulation. Politicians are always favorable to the idea that they can manipulate the size of the government by essentially outsourcing to what certain scholars, Paul Light, for example, calls the shadow government. The shadow government employment is essentially those individuals, university researchers, contractors, et cetera, that are literally being paid with federal dollars or federal grants and aid to the states, but that nevertheless are not in fact federal employees. People whose whole livelihood, whose whole employment depends upon federal spending, but who are nevertheless not counted in that column. The size, according to Light, the estimate of the size of the United States government is actually probably about 10 times too small relative to how many people are actually full-time dependent on government spending. So there's an easy way in which you can distort the numbers. But the other question is, if you could take all 2 million employees and say, which ones should we cut? Right? Simply say, okay, government is too big. We've got 2 million federal employees. I don't even know if that's the number. Let's just say 2 million federal employees. Which ones should we cut? How do we know the answer to that question? Well, look at the way that Congress deals with that question, right? This is the whole problem of the sequester. I was just in Washington a couple of weeks ago. I tried to get into the Cannon office building to go to a congressional briefing, and guess what? The normal doors that the public are allowed to enter the Cannon office building into were shut. You had to go all the way halfway around the building to the other side of the building in order to get through the building. Why? Well, they had put some of the screeners who check people when they walk into federal buildings on furlough as a way of inconveniencing, literally, of a way of inconveniencing the public to remind them that the sequester really hurts. Same thing with laying off air traffic controllers, right? You cut employees not based upon, this is Congress's method, not based upon whether those employees are actually serving legitimate functions or not, but instead, in their case, you politicize it and try to make it the ones that the public feels the most, that will capture your political ground. But if we literally just had a list, a comptroller here, an assistant bookkeeper there, et cetera, we wouldn't know which ones were essential or not without knowing what they actually did. And not just what they actually did in terms of how much of the economy they consumed or how much of the employment market they consumed, but rather what the actual functions that they were performing. Legal clerks, for example, might be performing legitimate functions, assisting and aiding the pursuit of justice in the court system. Whereas other individuals, bureaucrats who might oversee certain regulations, I don't know, OSHA regulations about whether that sign can be in orange or green or red, and whether that's consistent with an exit sign, and safety regulations that OSHA decides to pass or not. So there's not actually an easy way to say this number of government employees must go, this number must stay. The dependence argument as well, how many people depend on federal government? Dependence here, of course, is a very, very slippery term, right, as Romney found out. Dependence, if you simply define it as how many people pay taxes, how many people actually get government, some sort of government assistance, some sort of government subsidy, et cetera, dependence is a very slippery term because there are lots of people that we would otherwise declare to be economically independent that nevertheless, because of the form of their activity, don't necessarily pay high rates of income taxes. It's not an easy measurement. And dependence in many ways is also fluid in the sense that, yes, in fact, in any legitimate society, with a government that upholds individual rights, we all, in one sense of the word, depend on government. We depend on government to uphold our rights, to enforce the rules. So dependence does not necessarily have to mean dependence in the sense of being on the dole, for example, as it's typically argued. Dependence simply means that our society, the rules of a civilized society, have to be enforced by an agency. That agency is the government. And in that sense, we all depend on government. The only way to remove absolute dependence on government is to have no government. Which, of course, if that's the case, I suppose people can just choose to move to Somalia or something, if you think no government is the better thing. Then the last of these is the cost of government. You hear frequently, early sometime in the spring, typically sometimes later into the late spring, about tax freedom day. Right? The day when the average American starts working for him or herself rather than working for the government. How much of that individual's productive life, on average, over the course of a year, goes to pay tax bills or to pay fees, et cetera, for government, and when that individual actually starts taking home pay. Of course, again, like the shadow employment, there's a certain shadow cost of government. Because the literal amount of money that an individual pays into government tax programs or that pays into other programs often is offset by the fact that businesses and individuals pay enormous amounts in the private sector that otherwise would be unnecessary but for government regulation. So consider, for example, just take a recent example, the Dodd-Frank Act, which is going to create hundreds of new federal rules for the financial sector. Billions of dollars will be spent each year by companies in the financial sector in compliance costs, in hiring accountants and lawyers, maybe some of you, right? Probably a good opportunity for employment if you know securities law, if you know finance law, to make sure that those businesses are in legal compliance with the new regulations once those regulations are published and promulgated. That money that's being spent on salaries, on offices, on paperwork, on everything that goes into compliance technically is a cost of government. It's something that is a part of the payment that each of us makes. And obviously that gets handed back down to the American consumer in the form of higher prices and less productivity overall. So the problem of measurement is deeply, deeply rooted. I think that we can slice through this. I think that there's a very, very easy way that we can get through this problem of only focusing on what is non-essential. Because I think when we get mired down in this problem about talking about measurements, as we see, there's a lot of slipperiness here. There's a lot of ways in which this debate can pull people down and distract them, in a sense, from what is the real issue. Not merely the size, but actually the function and the role of government. So I think that to solve this conceptual problem, to get away from the idea of bigness as badness per se, what we need to do actually is to transform our focus into looking at the question of what is the legitimate purpose of government? And then secondly, what are the proper functions that uphold that purpose? If the purpose is to protect individual rights, if the fundamental foundation of our society, and this may be an object of disagreement, it's something that we have to either, if people don't agree with us, we persuade them, or we have to convince them why this is the best society. But if you can accept that, if you get on board with that, then the next question is, what does government actually do to uphold individual rights? What are the functions? You have to first ask what the purpose is and use that as the standard. Not merely the size of government, but the purpose. Then ask the question, what are the actual things that government does to uphold that? There are some obvious things, for example, the police force to arrest criminals, the military to protect us from foreign foes, the court system, as I said, to adjudicate resolutions, etc. But the actual ways that those function, the limitations, where those should stop functioning, where, for example, right, you just take a criminal procedure class. In the Fourth Amendment, where is it legitimate for police officers to act to try to gather evidence of criminal activity, and where must we curtail that activity? What is legitimate in upholding individual rights, and what is too much? Well, that's a question that has to be answered. It's a very difficult and complex question, but those are the types of questions we have to ask, not whether or not this creates too many police officers or not, whether the police forces are too big or not, but rather whether or not the rules, the laws, the institutions function in a way that upholds individual rights or that violates it. So the problem here that we can see is that if we focus solely on size, as many people do, conceptually, it makes the 19th century, for example, look really, really seductively good. In the 19th century, the United States government is often trotted out as a statistic, except for the years of the Civil War, generally was only about 5% to 8% of the economy. It was relatively small. It was a very small percentage of employment in the nation, and there was undoubtedly a massive amount of economic growth, a massive amount of new development, the whole Industrial Revolution taking place. And people generally see this as a good thing. But there are certain ways from the proper perspective that we can see that the government in the 19th century may have been insufficient to uphold individual rights. We need only look at, for example, the legacy of slavery, the Jim Crow laws, Chinese Exclusion Act, all kinds of ways that the government consciously curtailed the dynamism of the economy by legally excluding certain classes of individuals for no other reason than the color of their skin or their national origin or even their sex. All of that productivity was lost, even though there were astounding rates of economic growth in the 19th century, and it often attributed that it was simply because of the small size of the government. We have to recognize in a more robust way that our whole package, the whole passel of individual rights, was not being fully protected. That there were certain ways in which that government was too small to, in fact, uphold its legitimate functions. Now, to end, I want to just highlight the ways in which this will change a perspective on how we make this debate, how we actually go about understanding the debates today. Because one of the most frequent questions I get about this is you say, okay, you want to differentiate between proper and improper functions of government based upon its purpose. If the purpose is to uphold individual rights, to protect individual rights, and we can use that as a guide for understanding what should and should not be a function of government, and then saying that what we want is not small government or properly sized government. What we want is fully legitimate government, government that meets its proper purpose, whatever that size happens to be. And if that size in certain instances needs to grow, for example, in response to a looming international threat, or for example, in response to changing military technology, where more spending or more personnel are required to continue upholding rights, we need to recognize that that's a good thing, and not simply draw a line in the sand and say this many employees and this much spending and no more. But the other side of this question is when we get down to the category, it's not merely proper and improper functions of government. Today, if you literally could lay out and conceptually gather and keep in your head, actually understand at one point, all at once, all of the things that government does today. Right? This would be a Herculean task to just think about what does government even do. And you were to drop them into different categories. You say, here is something that should be an action of government, and here's something that shouldn't, based upon this standard. What you would find, I think, is that the category of improper actually needs its own division. It needs its own separate box to divide these up. Because there are things that government does today that are not illegitimate things for people to do, but rather that are things that would be better privatized, that would be better handled by market dynamics. So for example, the government provides all kinds of services. It regulates all kinds of safety standards, for example. Such things can be handled by the private market. Those are functions of government. Those are actual things that government does today that are illegitimate in terms of the upholding of individual rights, but which would not in and of themselves be illegitimate. Versus, for example, those things that government does, punishing people from being too successful as a function of the antitrust laws, which should not be the object of anyone's daily business, that are illegitimate per se. So when you divide up that box and start to think about this and actually use the standard of individual rights, what you come to discover is that there are things which the market, outside of government, could actually deal with more robustly and more successfully if it was left to individuals to order their own affairs and provide these services, which are needed services. It's not as though we can simply do away with all the things that we consider to be illegitimate as a function of government, because some of those things ought to be done, just not by government. So by returning the focus to the idea of individual rights, the right to life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness, and all of the implications of that, by recentering our focus on that question, we can, in a way, do away with both sides of the debate. Both sides of the debate about whether government needs to grow in response to a certain crisis or whether it needs to shrink because it's getting too big, both sides of that partisan debate literally fall by the wayside. Because the question now undercuts all that. It says, what is legitimate about government? You see the foible of just trying to defend it on a matter of size. You're always running against that measurement problem. You're always running against the problem of not knowing exactly what the perfect size of government is and not knowing what it is based upon any external standard. right? There's a book, just to end on this last example, there's a book, when I first started doing some of the research on this, about the size of government, the number of employees, there was a book that was published by Stephen Moore. Some of you may know Stephen Moore, who is on the editorial board at the Wall Street Journal. And he published a book about, in the mid-1990s, just after, or actually it was written just before and published just after the so-called Republican Revolution. And Stephen Moore was an economics consultant for the Newt Gingrich contract with America, et cetera, et cetera. And he published this little book about government, America's #1 growth sector. And it was all about the size of government and how much it was growing. And I opened up this book, which was now 20 years old. And I looked at this book, and it was actually kind of amusing because in the beginning, it was projecting a hypothetical future where in, I think it was 2008, it was a sort of down the road, what would happen in the future if government didn't change from where it was headed in 1994. And it looked at 2008, and it was talking about billion-dollar deficits, right? It was talking about numbers of employees that were far smaller. It actually under-predicted the problem. And the issue here is that if you simply took what Moore was saying about size and froze it at his moment, you would have nothing better than what you had in 1994, which I submit may both be too small in some sectors and too large in some sectors, but you simply wouldn't know. What you have to do is not just focus on projections of size, but what government actually does. So let me end there so that we have some time for questions. Hopefully that's provocative enough to get some questions out of the audience. So go right ahead. Oh, thank you very much, first of all. So, questions? Kevin, go ahead.
You spoke about the idea that programs or government functions like the ones like OSHA per se could be handled better by the private sector. And I think a major criticism is that maybe there wouldn't be enough private organizations willing to engage in that kind of activity, or maybe private businesses without the existence of OSHA just wouldn't care what those private versions of OSHA would have to say because they wouldn't have the force of government behind them. How would you deal with that concern, considering OSHA might be considered more efficient if it has the backing of government force?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question about if my argument is that many of the current objects of government, the current forms of government, could be better handled in the private sector. For example, OSHA's, I do find it somewhat personally amusing that you talk about OSHA as a more efficient solution. I don't even think people at OSHA would probably say that. But there is the backing of universality, right? At least it has the claim to universality. No one gets away with being outside of the scope of the law, even though there are, of course, compliance issues. One of the interesting aspects of your question, which I noted, was you said if there wasn't enough, or if there wasn't enough provision. The question is, how do we actually measure that? How do we know whether or not businesses have enough safety oversight? Whether they're willing enough to dedicate themselves to demonstrating to the consuming public that their products actually meet an external standard of safety. Right? Now, of course, in general, we have a whole area of the law that deals with this problem, the tort law, which, of course, needs reform in many, many ways. But nevertheless, leaving aside the private law, why would there not be enough in the private sector to do this? The question that we have to ask is, how do we know when we have enough? And the answer to that is essentially my answer to that question is when the consuming public demands that much. Right? And not demanding it through the form of government. Because in a sense, the problem with demanding it through government is saying that I want this much safety oversight, and I don't care how much you want. I want it to be universalized because this is my preference, or at least this is the preference of the majority. One of the geniuses of the original constitutional system, of the original conception of the constitutional system, as imperfect as it might have been, was the idea that it is not a provision for the majority simply to express its preference regardless of how that impacts people that are not in the majority. To the extent that they're talking about legitimate functions of government, and you're talking about the degree to which certain activities take place, that may be an issue of majority vote. But our rights, right, I mean, to quote Justice Jackson, for example, are not subject to a majority vote. That's exactly what the Bill of Rights is about. That's exactly what our constitutional order is about. And when you consider that the choices of how you provide for safety, right, are actually a good that people pay for. It's not some disembodied standard. Safety is a good that people pay for. Some people choose to drive larger, safer cars. Other people choose to drive faster, less safe cars. They express their preference in the market. They vote with their feet, or their dollars, so to speak. They actually choose how much safety they want based upon the goods that they buy. They express, economists sometimes call this revealed preference. They reveal the preference that they have based upon their actions. The consuming public can do the same. companies can choose to engage or not engage in these safety organizations. Underwriter Laboratories, for example, a private organization that sets standards for electrical products that people can choose to look whether such products meet those standards or not and buy them or not based on those standards. Part of the problem, and part of the reason why I think the private market actually would be more efficient, is that would actually reach to a point where we knew how much information the public wanted, and it would put the responsibility back on the individuals. Right now, there is, in a sense, a moral hazard problem with, for example, OSHA. People assume that someone is watching after these questions, and they don't exercise judgment. They don't exercise their own reason to judge whether they have bought enough in the marketplace of the goods that they desire, if those goods are safety standards or product specifications. Instead, they simply trust the moral hazard problem. They trust that this agency has taken care of that problem without actually having to gather the information to inform themselves about that. They're rationally ignorant, but in a way that creates a moral hazard. Right? They say, oh, someone else is taking care of the problem. And then when they're damaged by this, they wonder why. Instead of saying, I need to exercise the judgment to determine how much safety I want, and then when I get that much safety and I pay for it, if I don't like it, I can pay for more, or if it's too expensive, I can pay for less, in a sense. Because that risk burden is ultimately borne by the individual. Other questions? Yes?
So, I understand what you're saying, like, as far as, like, the law, like, you know, one-page law can be just as bad as a 2,500-page law, right? That makes sense, but at some level, the number of laws out there, even if each one individually is good, it takes away my limit. Every law out there is something I can't do. So even if each one individually is good, at some point they add up to creating something that's bad. Especially when they all start to interact with each other. And so like, so how do you respond to when there's so many laws on the books that nobody really can understand what's going on? How is that not just big being bad?
Right. Yeah. There is a. So what I don't want to suggest is that there is no relationship between, say, for example, the numbers of law. I mean, you say, okay, I found country C in your example, A, B, and now C, and C consumes 90% of GDP for government. I'd say, okay, well, that's clearly a threshold issue where we're not talking about finer distinctions between 11 or 20%. There is undoubtedly a threshold of the size, which is per se, we kind of look at it and we say, you know, after that point, the default is going to be to assume that it's bad. Right? We have to still do the investigation. We still have to empirically investigate whether the individual laws and programs, because if we're going to sort that out, if we ever want to reverse direction, we actually have to sort through and say, don't just wipe the slate clean and start from anew. Actually look at those and investigate empirically which ones are good and bad, and then try to roll that back. But the default judgment in some cases, given the size or given the number of laws, can be, you know, by default, we're going to assume that these are bad. It's just too much. A 2,500-page law, right? That literally people can't read before they even vote on, right? Something's wrong with that. I agree with you on that. But on the other hand, one of the things that you said that I want to take issue with is the idea that no matter how many of the laws and no matter how many of the conciseness of the laws, that those are all essentially restrictions of your liberty. They're not, right? I mean, so for example, the law against murder doesn't restrict my liberty. I've killed exactly the number of people that I want to kill in my life, which is 0. Right? That law has had no effect on my exercise of my liberty. Right? I'm borrowing that, by the way, from Penn Jillette, Penn and Teller. You know, I've raped and I've murdered exactly the number of people that I desire to rape and murder in my lifetime, which is 0. Right? And the law hasn't restricted that liberty. So we have to differentiate between laws which enhance our ability to be free, right, and laws which restrict our freedom. And the method by which we have to do that is not the question of are there a lot of them or not, are they complex or not, but are they designed to uphold individual rights and remove force from social relationships, right? A free society is a society which relegates the use of force to retaliatory purposes only by an objective agency that's checked by the rule of law. So on one aspect of that, I agree with you. If the laws become so complex that the people against whom the laws are being written or that are supposed to comply with the laws literally cannot understand them, they're too voluminous or too complex, that the people can't, they're not knowable in that sense. If we use one of the hallmarks of the rule of law, knowability. If the laws aren't knowable and predictable and comprehensible by the public, then that is by default a bad law. And it is by default, even if it means to uphold individual rights, it doesn't in the sense that people can't understand it. So that is, the rule of law considerations do enter in as well. But it's a delicate balance between saying just so many laws is necessarily bad. Yes, right? When it's 90% of GDP, or when there are literally more laws than if you could read however many pages a day, you would spend 3 years just reading the laws, right? At that point, we say our default judgment is that there's a lot of bad things in there, just no matter what. But we actually still have to go through and do the empirical look and say, this is a bad one, this is not, based upon this other standard rather than just size. Size is bad, but not everything within size is bad, if that makes sense. Does that sort of help clarify? Other questions? Yeah, Arthur?
I mean, to follow up on that question, do you really think that it's even possible that under a proper system of government in a free society that there would be that kind of complexity of laws? And how many laws would you estimate today are completely violate our rights?
Whereas which, I mean, I had a colleague who once asked me, some of you may be familiar, so there's a book that was published, I guess in the last decade, by Chip Miller and Bob Levy, the Dirty Dozen. So Bob Levy at Cato Institute and Chip Miller, who used to be at the Institute for Justice. And it was about what they called the 12 worst Supreme Court decisions of the last 100 years or whatever it was. And a colleague of mine and I had a long conversation, and I even for a while pursued a project that never went anywhere, of doing the same version of that book except for laws, actual legislation, the 10 worst laws of the last 100 years. And boy, there were a lot of candidates. And we had a lot of fun trying to pick the candidates. Not just, okay, what are laws we don't like? What is this law? But, to try to, the pervasiveness of the law, how much of the economy it affected, how many pages it created, how many new jobs it created, et cetera, et cetera. Government jobs, not, job creation. And we ultimately whittled it down to a list. But then there was a conversation we had one day where he said, do you think you could even come up with 10 laws that have been passed in the last 100 years that are genuinely all around 100% good laws? And it was tough. I mean, first, legislative history is incredibly complex, so maybe some law in some minor area might have been, all rights protecting law, expanding the protection of, intellectual property or defining better what certain relationships are. I don't know how many laws there would ultimately be. I mean, I don't know. The vast majority of the laws that we probably have now are rights violating in some capacity. Not all of them are rights violating wholly, in the sense that everything about them is rights violating. Some of them are rights violating only in the sense that they're characterized by special interest, legislative pull that people exert in order to get laws which would otherwise be rights protecting, but which serve certain interest groups because of the way the legislation is passed, et cetera. But the complexity of the law in a free society would still exist to some degree. I mean, in other words, we couldn't just abolish all the lawyers, right? There's still a role for specialization. In a truly free society with a truly rights-respecting government, there are still issues which are beyond the technical grasp of the average citizen. So, for example, the rules whereby you can determine liability for transporting hazardous chemicals of certain kinds of exotic, organic fertilizers or something, and the kinds of protections that show a sufficient degree of negligence or not. I mean, I don't know that I could just spin that off the top of my head. I think there would have to be an investigation, and that law might in fact be complex to describe the kinds of things which would be the burden of negligence or not, et cetera, if that was something that the legislature saw fit to recognize and standardize in the law. So there would be some complexity about technical issues, but in general, I think it would be radically reduced because it would be something that literally, in order to meet the rule of law considerations, individuals have to be able to grasp or have to be able to have legal counsel grasp the purpose, the scope, and the intent of the law, and whether or not an action, right? Predictability is a huge value in rule of law. Whether or not a particular action will in the future be determined to be a violation of law. To the extent that you don't know the answer to that question, you don't have a rights-respecting law. Even if the purpose of the law, even if the aim of the law is to protect rights, if you say, well, you have to wait until you litigate it to find out whether you violated the law or not, you don't really have good law. Right? You have an opportunity for people to fight over the result, not an opportunity for people to take action freely to pursue their values in compliance with the law, in compliance with other individuals' rights. So that kind of complexity is not going to go away completely, but it will be greatly reduced, except for perhaps in certain technical areas or in areas which are not the areas of daily life, right? I mean, most people don't have to worry about transporting chemicals or something. Most people don't have to worry about these kinds of complex technical issues. Nevertheless, those issues should be comprehensible by someone with a familiarity in the field. Other questions? Yeah, Kevin, go ahead.
I'm kind of curious about how you handle concerns about social justice. Because one of the things that government does not change, the vast majority of the population would consider a good thing, but it seems like their standards would have to eliminate is providing education. And there's this idea, or at least this is justifiable concern, that if government didn't provide, say, K-12 education, university education, a large portion of education services would disappear. So in a society where people actually care about people getting educated, how do you handle those kind of concerns about, specifically when those concerns are rooted in a desire for quality?
Right, yeah, the question, I mean, that somewhat touches on the issue that I mentioned at the very end of differentiating between things that government actually does now, which are legitimate things for people to do, generally, and things which the government shouldn't do. So if we leave aside that, or things that no one should do, in other words, that no one should enforce anti-competition standards or whatever, but that people should educate, right? I mean, it's just because government shouldn't do it doesn't mean no one should do it. The answer to that is rooted in large part, in history. Right, so let's just take education as an example. Today, of course, we have a system whereby we almost universally accept as a default fact that local governments will provide primary through secondary education, that states will operate their own university systems, that private universities, even like Stanford, will receive massive amounts of federal funding in order to operate, et cetera, and that without such assistance, without such property tax base at the local level, and without such assistance at the national level, such institutions would cease to exist. Now, on the one hand, there is the obvious historical case that such things came into being at a very specific time and that they were handled outside of government prior to this. Right? That prior to the mid-19th century, all primary and to what degree they had what we call secondary education was provided privately to the extent that it was demanded. Right? I mean, going back to your other question, as a matter of determining what is just, we have to ask ourselves not the standard that we might impose, everyone should have a college education, because I want a college education, but rather, how much education would everyone actually desire in this economy? Now, opportunities for that, literal, 19th century style racial discrimination or literally barring individuals from pursuing that kinds of education, obviously should be eliminated. Those are some instances where there was not enough law regulating things like access to private education, et cetera, by individuals. But the argument that without government these things would go away is actually an argument that's historically been made before and proven undoubtedly to be false in the United States. And that is, at the time of disestablishment, right, which did not take place immediately as a matter of the passage of the First Amendment. Disestablishment actually had to take place in the states. The First Amendment, of course, until it was incorporated on religion issues, didn't speak to established churches in the states. Massachusetts, for example, had an established church, a church that was supported by taxpayer assistance up through the 1820s. And the argument that was made as the 13 states originally, and then, of course, most of the states that entered after the Union didn't have established churches, but as these states disestablished, in other words, disentangled the government from providing religious services, individuals said religion's going to wither away. People are going to become irreligious. So the question is, if you think that removal of taxpayer assistance for primary education would mean that there was no education, do you think the same thing about churches? Do you think without taxpayer assistance, the churches have just withered away? No, actually, they've flourished. Right? There are more churches, Americans have more churches today, for good or for ill, than they did in the early part of the 19th century when they were actually taxpayer assisted. The argument is that the free market won't provide this good, even though everyone seemingly demands it. The question of the marginal issues about access and about equity concerns and about whether individuals have that provision, if that's a matter of law, is a different question from whether or not the market would provide such things. The fact, I mean, if you look at the market today, there's all kinds of, on the margins of education, private provision of educational services to supplement what is going on, and in fact, that could, in fact, supplant what is going on in the primary and secondary educational system, but is literally prohibited in some cases by law from simply taking over. That there are ways that individuals could educate their children, that parents could choose to educate their children entirely outside of this system, but because of regulations, mandatory attendance laws, surveillance laws over homeschooling, things like this, they literally cannot do so. The market is actually teeming with opportunities for people to be educated at all of these levels in ways that would even reach down to the lowest levels of poverty, but are literally prohibited by barriers to entry that the government schooling system has created. So I think that the equity concerns here would literally be, not as big a concern as people project them to be, and B, the object for entrepreneurial individuals to solve problems. Right? That this is one of the great things, is that problems will arise. People will say, oh, we're not getting enough of this good here. But in the rest of the economic sectors, when someone identifies a problem like that, they say, you know, no one's providing people with devices that they can walk around in their pockets and make telephone calls with. Wouldn't that be cool if such a thing existed? And so an entrepreneur says, hey, let's talk to some technology guys and see if this is possible. And then they start, you know, looking at radio signals and different things and looking at military technology, and eventually somebody comes up with a cheap, affordable cell phone, right? The same thing would exist. Hey, there's not enough education being provided to this community, or there's not enough education being provided of this kind. If there is a demand for that, there's a profit opportunity. And that's something that entrepreneurs and capital markets would be drawn to in the way that they're drawn to provision of goods or provision of services that don't exist but that are nevertheless demanded. Now, that doesn't guarantee that every single individual will get the education at no cost, right, or at a transferred cost in the way that it does today. That ultimately has to be something that is earned and provided for. But I think that without the kinds of regulatory environment that we have today, those goods would be much cheaper. Right? The fact that a guy like Sal Khan can provide, you know, Khan Academy, if you know about this on YouTube, he literally starts tutoring his nieces and nephews about calculus or something. And he then launches an entire YouTube channel, which really has revolutionized, in some ways, tutoring and math and education all across the board. And he does so just because he loves it. And he didn't even bother to monetize it. Other people are trying to monetize it and actually provide it as a service. But it's simple, technology facilitates it. It actually is far cheaper than people estimate, because you can't estimate the cost until you actually try to solve the problem. Right? It's easy to say, oh, this is how much the public school education costs. But maybe there are more innovative ways of doing it than putting 30 students in the same physical building in front of a teacher, et cetera, et cetera. There's technology out there. There's all kinds of solutions. We just don't know about them because we're not trying them in a certain sense. Any last questions before we wrap up? We're probably, yeah, go ahead, Arthur. This is the last one? Okay, yeah. Anybody, I mean, just not to step on Arthur's toes, but anybody that hasn't asked a question want to ask one? All right, go ahead, Arthur.
So with respect to emerging areas where we do need to have good laws, for instance, I mean, these aren't emerging areas. We all needed good laws for a while, but things like water rights, airspace, the electromagnetic spectrum, and all kinds of things where we need to figure out what the property rights are so we can figure out the proper laws to protect them. I don't have a lot of confidence in the legislators that we have today to figure that kind of thing out. Who would you, if you could invent the structure of the society, who would you have do that? I mean, what kind of...
Yeah, I mean, you raise a number of interesting examples. So I mean, in a way, you've already posed a pair of examples that I think might be illustrative of how this problem would ultimately be solved. So these are all property issues. The electromagnetic spectrum, right? So why is it that back in the 1930s, the forerunner of the FCC asserted that the public owned the airwaves, right, and all things that could transmit through them, including radio signals, electromagnetic signals, et cetera. And forever on, they license and slice up the spectrum and allocate it in the ways that they want, reserve certain parts of it, auction off other parts of it, et cetera, to the point where we now have a large amount of confusion and literally a huge amount of waste, as I understand it from the technological side, a huge amount of waste where there's bandwidth that's just not being used that could be providing huge new services to consumers, and they're ready entrepreneurs waiting to do this. That essentially was originally a top-down solution. A government regulatory agency, when the technology was in emergence, went ahead and asserted a public ownership of something that, a so-called public goods argument, a public ownership of this, and then forever after asserted that government had the right to allocate this in the public interest. And the public interest ever after has been literally captured by special interests. The regulatory capture in this area is notorious. Various large media companies, et cetera, can dominate the legislative process and write the rules in the way that they want. Now, you also mentioned the issue of riparian rights, right? Which in the common law development, in the early development, and let's call that up through, I mean, I'm not an expert on riparian rights, but let's call that up through the 1850s. Issues of riparian usage that go back to time immemorial in the common law, et cetera, had as a standard emerging not a top-down solution, but a solution that emerged out of actual practice, that had to be rationalized periodically in the law as new technologies, for example, mills and more sophisticated dams and dredging and other types of water usage could take place. But the law adapted to that based upon developing circumstances and started to, as the common law is wont to do, developing standards whereby new cases could be decided. Now, there are undoubtedly in these new technological areas developments that are far too fast to wait for even the most efficient court system to develop these standards. In that case, though, I think that there is, in a truly free society, there is a possibility, not perhaps today's politicians, but industry individuals who can explain the technological problems to a legislative body, and legislators who genuinely care about the rights, respect, and issues of property, rather than the interest groups or the pushing back and forth of different industry, but actually say, are there property rights here first? If there are, how do we know how to define them? And if we can define them, how do we know how to protect them? How do we know how to define what a violation is? So if I'm transmitting, with 600 kilowatts on a radio tower on my backyard, and I have a group of listeners, and you come in with a kind of nuisance interference broadcast by using on the same frequency a 100 kilowatt tower only less than a mile away. Have you created a nuisance in the same sense that, or a trespass, if you will, in the same sense that you would with physical property? That's a question that can be explained by the technological experts. That politicians who actually cared, legislators who actually cared about solving those issues could, I think, ultimately do that. Today, they're far too pressed by special interest concerns and almost, not literally auctioning off the rules, but auctioning them off in the sense that the big players, right? And this is the irony of a lot of these public ownership, is that it's really the dominant firms, the large players, exactly the opposite of the small guy, that get to set the terms of debate, such that emerging technologies, small entrepreneurs, sometimes immigrants, sometimes teenagers, can't enter markets because big dominant firms who have already captured the regulations prohibit it in ways that stultifies and stalls the technological development. And the spectrum is a big example of that. I'm sure there are people who have come up with inordinately awesome ways to use spectrum that's just not available to them by regulation. So I don't necessarily say, okay, look, we could trust legislators, but I would say that with expert assistance and with someone committed to the idea of protecting rights, that might be possible. Okay, so let's wrap up here, and thank you all for staying and for your good questions and for hosting the event in the first place. All right, thanks.